Our first speaker, and their keynote speaker for this afternoon is Ricardo Carvajal. He is of counsel with the firm of Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara in Washington, D.C., that specializes in FDA regulatory matters. Prior to joining his firm, he served as the Associate Chief Counsel in the FDA's Office of Chief Counsel, where he took part in the formulation of regulatory responses to advances in nanotechnology. Now he provides FDA regulatory counseling to manufacturers and marketers for foods, drugs, devices, and cosmetics. He will highlight for us today the controversy over the FDA's regulation of nanotechnology and its potential impacts on this whole field. So, welcome to the podium.
My thanks to Martine and to Barrick, and I apologize in advance for my voice. It's a little more fragile than I would like it to be. And it's certainly a privilege to be designated as the lawyer to come address a group of scientists such as yourself. I dare say that I enjoy attending your conferences more than you would enjoy attending one of mine. They're very different cultures that don't always easily mix. At my conferences, I hear a lot about risk, and there's almost a palpable element of fear and anxiety, and then I come to your conferences, and what I hear is hope and possibility. So I like I said, I'm very happy to be here. Here we go. Well, actually, before we get started, I think by way of background, when I was a graduate student in biology at University of Michigan, I helped teach a course called The Science and Politics of Frankenfoods. And for those of you who haven't heard the term before, Frankenfoods is sort of the vernacular term for genetically modified foods. And it was the term that was generated in part by consumer activists, but then picked up as by the media, and sort of became a shorthand for all the risks that could be associated with the new technology. And that was kind of my introduction to all the factors that go beyond science and can sometimes have effects that are somewhat unpredictable on the development of a new technology. Now, when I went to FDA and had an opportunity to work on some of those same issues, again from the food perspective, and then nano came along, and looking at those things, it was really a lucky break for me. So what I hope to do today is bring sort of that perspective to bear, the internal FDA perspective, and couple that with the things that I've been observing now as a participant on the outside, pull all that together and open just a little window into the anxiety of the realm that I typically deal with. I don't want to be Dr. Killjoy, so it's not going to be a big window. It's just going to be a little window. I like to start with the big picture. Here we see international government investment in nanotechnology. So this doesn't even factor in private sector investment. But you can see a pretty dramatic increase over the course of the past decade, and this chart really leaves off in 2004. The trend lines all keep going upward. The yellow line is U.S. investment, U.S. government investment. The green line is the Japanese government investment. Blue line is Western Europe, and red line is others. I think if we could break out others and pull out China, I think that we would see some pretty interesting figures there as well, because China has a lot of money to spend, and nanotechnology is one of the places that they're choosing to spend it. So this is the current generation's version of the Apollo project, making a huge public investment in the development of this technology, and that's a lot of what's propelling this into the marketplace. Domestically, we have the National Nanotechnology, which is our government program, started in 2001 to coordinate federal nanotech research, R&D research. And we have 25 participating agencies, including FDA. Over $1.5 billion has been allocated under the NNI, and it has been split out among 13 agencies. So as you can see with the numbers, if 25 agencies participate and only 13 are getting funding, that means that 8 are not. And until very recently, FDA was one of those 8. These numbers are impossibly small, and I don't really expect you to read them, but I think the pattern is pretty discernible. You have NNI funding from 2001 to 2010, and you can see that, it's really just a handful of agencies, not surprisingly starting with the Department of Defense as being the major recipient of NNI funding, progressing up through 2010, and you can see more agencies being added into the funding mix, and the amount of funding jumping up to on the order of 1.7, 1.8 billion. But two things are notable about this, and two things that have raised alarm among outside observers. One is FDA funding. FDA, until very recently, didn't get any funding whatsoever under the NNI. That means that whatever money FDA spent on getting ready for what is expected to be the coming wave of technology, it was cannibalizing from other programs. And if you read the newspaper ever, you see FDA routinely on the front page of the newspaper because of some issue with drugs or an issue with a device, or lately a lot of issues with foods. And so FDA has a lot of very pressing public health priorities, and it has until now had to weigh very carefully which of those things to pull money from to try to address what are clearly some issues that nanotechnology presents. The second thing is this EHS funding, environmental health and safety research funding, again, until very recently added up to less than 1% of the total expenditure on research. Now, percentages don't mean everything. A very small percent of a very large amount can still be a lot of money. But I think for a lot of folks, the fact that the kind of research that just looks to see what potential risks might be presented by these products was being limited to 1% of total funding struck a lot of folks as grossly inadequate. And there have been a lot of calls over the past few years to boost that significantly. Now, in terms of what FDA has done about nanotechnology, again, with the money that it's cannibalized from other programs, they formed a nanotechnology task force in 2006. They had a public meeting and requested comment also that same year. And then in what I would consider to be light speed for a government agency approach to anything, particularly something as complicated as this, a year later, they had pulled together this report and had issued it. Things move very quickly in nanotechnology. You say 2007 to 2010, this report's 3 years old. FDA still considers it to be current. So if you wanted to pick it up and read it tomorrow, I don't think that you would find that there have been any significant changes in the intervening time. And I'll take a few minutes to review some of the highlights of that report. One of the things that it addressed was the need for FDA to bulk up on its scientific capacity. So they recognized that their scientific capacity had to be improved, that there were some serious questions about the adequacy of the tools that they would need to describe and evaluate nanomaterials. That lack of data on nanomaterial safety is a problem, and FDA's access to information has been a continuing issue as it tries to get a handle on this technology, because FDA has really very limited ways of trying to secure data from industry outside of the product approval process. And so in light of all this, FDA said, we're still feeling our way through this, therefore early consultation is highly recommended, especially for combination products. And I'll talk a little bit more about combination products in a few minutes. A second thing that the report addressed was the adequacy of FDA's authority, and that's the piece that I had a small part in. For those of you not familiar with the U.S. legal system, FDA derives its authority from the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. That's the law that Congress passed. And then FDA has to implement that law, and so then it issues its regulations. So in the U.S., we talk about statutes, and those are the laws passed by Congress, and then regulations, which are the authorized agency's implementation of those laws. And what FDA concluded after a fairly comprehensive internal review looking at its authority over all of the different product categories was that they didn't really need any more statutory authority. They didn't need Congress to pass more laws for them. And they also concluded, at least as of 2007, for FDA to issue nanotechnology-specific regulations wasn't warranted, and I'll talk a little bit more about the thinking behind that in a few minutes. But they did concede that their authority was, in quotes, more comprehensive for products subject to pre-market authorization, which are all the products that we've been hearing about here today, the drugs, the devices, the biologics, and the combination products. The products subject to post-market authorization, as a general matter, foods, dietary supplements, a subcategory called medical foods that you may have heard of, cosmetics. Those are areas where, the flip side would be that FDA's authority is somewhat less comprehensive, and I'll get into a little more detail on that. The last piece, though, of the report was it included these recommendations for FDA to issue guidance. The report said, FDA, please, issue guidance that addresses submission of additional data, potential effects on regulatory pathways, and additional steps that might be needed to address safety or quality issues. FDA has yet to issue that guidance, and it has been 3 years, and at least as of last year, FDA's view, if you went to each of the product center heads, there was a conference on nanotechnology policy and regulation in Washington, D.C., where senior representatives of each of the product centers, so CDRH, CEDAR, CIFSAN for the foods, and CBER, basically all took turns saying, we really haven't seen enough of these products yet to be able to give you any guidance. We're not entirely sure how or if these products are really going to substantially alter the kinds of information we're going to want to see from you, or how we're going to process these applications. And so until we see more of these products, we can't issue guidance. Well, on the other hand, you have everybody who's involved in trying to bring these products to market saying, we'd like a little more clarity. It's hard for us to know what exactly to submit to you until you give us some guidance. So I think, for the moment at least, there's a little bit of a hang-up here, based on the fact that FDA just I think doesn't have a comfort level with all the different potential applications of this technology. Now, at about the same time that FDA's report on nanotechnology came out, this report of the Subcommittee on Science and Technology came out, and it was prepared for the FDA Science Board, and it reached some pretty difficult conclusions for FDAers and anybody who's interested in the health of the agency to stomach. On the one hand, saying FDA's scientific base has eroded, its scientific organizational structure is weak. Second, the scientific workforce doesn't have sufficient capacity and capability. Third, its IT infrastructure, just the way that it handles information and stores and conveys information within the agency is inadequate. So you have this, what amounts to I wouldn't say it's a vote of no confidence, but certainly it's an expression of very strong concern about the direction that the agency was headed in. And if you were to plot over time, we were talking about laws and regulations. If you were to plot over time over the last 15 years, the amount of responsibilities that have been given to FDA, and also plot the amount of funding that the agency has gotten, those two lines diverge very strongly. And it's largely as a consequence of that we see an FDA that is, I think by historical standards, in a weakened state. It simply hasn't been given enough money over the last 10 or 15 years to do what it needs to do. And so, and under those circumstances, you can understand why folks would start to be a little concerned about the FDA's readiness to tackle something like the range of products that we've been talking about for the last 2 days. So how is FDA regulating nanotechnology? Well, on the one hand, FDA, I think, would say there are some things here that are clearly not new. We've been dealing with substances that pass through the nano size phase in one form or another for a long time, but certainly a lot of the applications that we've been hearing about today are fairly novel. Going back to the definitional issue, FDA just at this point doesn't feel like it can define nanotechnology in a way that would be defensible for regulatory purposes, and I can go into that in a little more detail in a couple of slides. So FDA continues to use its traditional risk-based approach, focusing on products, not processes, and I think for those of you involved in biotech, FDA took a similar line, particularly with the products subject to post-market authorization like the foods. I think FDA is just in a position still where there isn't sufficient information to say that nanotechnology products or products derived from nanotechnology as a class pose a greater risk than products that are not so derived. So I think we see, a familiar tension that FDA has dealt with over and over in the context of lots of different products. How do we facilitate getting this technology to market so that it helps people, and on the other hand, make sure that it's safe? And FDA, I think, has usually felt that if it's getting shot at from all sides, then it's probably doing a pretty good job. But you've seen on some other issues the pendulum swing back and forth, people saying drugs aren't getting to market fast enough, and then drugs are getting to market too fast and they're killing people. So the FDA just has to walk that tightrope. With the definitional issue, the whole problem, from a legal perspective, a regulatory perspective, I like this graph here because, and I think you've all probably seen it before, but if you look at what's designated as the nano world, there isn't, FDA, whatever decisions FDA makes in this area have to have some kind of a rational basis, a scientific basis. This, by the way, is available online, and if you'd like me to email you the link for it, I'd be happy to. But if you look at the nano world, and if you look at that cutoff of 100 nanometers, which the NNI definition cites that 1 to 100 nanometer range as part of the characteristics of nanotechnology, how in the world are you going to say that for regulatory purposes we're going to impose additional requirements if you are at 100, but at 101 those requirements don't apply? I haven't, I'm not even going to pretend to be a scientist, but I haven't heard anybody express with any degree of confidence that there is some kind of a cutoff, some kind of set of definitional criteria that would justify the imposition of additional requirements. I put this together because I think it's a surprise sometimes to folks who deal with one specialized set of products. And my apologies to those of you who smoke. I did not yet put tobacco products in here. FDA now has authority over tobacco products. But since I didn't think that they were particularly relevant to the things we're talking about today, I'm leaving those off. So basically for any article, and this is part of what makes it fun as a lawyer to work in this area, is that when a substance comes in the door and folks are thinking about how to get it to market, in a lot of instances, it is possible to follow, if not all 5 of these different pathways. It is not unusual for at least 3 different pathways to be available. So depending on the identity of the product, yes, but more dependent on how the product is intended to be used. It could potentially be brought to market as a cosmetic, a food or supplement, a drug, a medical device, or a biologic. And I put some of these in green and some of these in red. The red sort of denotes what later on I will talk to as the red category products, red biotech, red nanotech. Those are the medical applications, if you will. And then you have sort of the green applications, primarily in the food and supplement arena or in the agricultural arena. And also it helps to remind us that the red is the pre-market authorization products, and the green is the post-market authorization products. Now, those are gross generalizations because one of the sort of case studies that I'll talk about in a few minutes is a drug, and it's an OTC drug, and that drug did not go through a pre-market approval review or any kind of pre-market approval process. So just bear in mind that these are gross generalizations. And then you see the big oval combo at the bottom. For a lot of the products that we've been talking about today, and part of what makes them fascinating, is that they would classify as combination products because they incorporate either a drug and a device, or sometimes a drug and a biologic, or in some instances you're going to see all 3. And so there's going to be this preliminary step that you would go through with the Office of Combination Products to get a jurisdictional assignment, so that then you would know what process your product is going to have to go through and what criteria it's going to have to meet in order to get to market. But I think part of what is starting to raise alarms is the different criteria that apply depending on whether we're talking about a red category product or a green category product. I inserted these because it seemed to me that there had been enough presentations of products that appeared to me to be combination products. And so it's interesting to just talk briefly about the criteria. FDA allows under their regulations, it's the primary mode of action that's going to govern assignment to one of the centers. And it's kind of a tricky determination to make because it really requires FDA to decide what the primary mode of action is, which mode of action gives the greatest contribution to the overall intended therapeutic effects. And in some cases, it's not going to be clear that one predominates over another. You might have, what I would call a tie between the two or three different components. And then the question is there a center that already has experience evaluating the kinds of safety and efficacy issues that the new product raises? And if nobody has experience with it, then the question is there a center that has evaluated products that raise similar safety and efficacy issues? At the end of the day, one center is going to take the lead, but I think as some of you have already experienced, FDA is going to make sure that it draws on whatever expertise it needs to draw on. So even though CDER might take the lead on a particular combination product, there are going to be folks from CDRH involved for the device aspects of the product. And then the last piece I'll touch on is both informal and formal determinations of jurisdiction are available, and if anybody wants to know more about those, we can talk afterward. If you haven't seen this chart available, it's available through a sort of an older publication called the CDER Handbook, and I included it just because I think this is a process that most of you all are probably familiar with. It's the traditional drug development pathway where you have your preclinical studies, then you have your phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and the principal point I'll make is that for cosmetic products in particular, if we take new drugs, if this is the one end of the continuum, what you have to go through to get a new drug on the market, at the other end of the continuum, you would have a cosmetic product. A cosmetic manufacturer is not required to submit any information whatsoever about its product to FDA. As long as that manufacturer is willing to assume the burden of establishing that the product is safe, because on the back end, if there's a problem, they're going to be on the hook for the safety of that product. But as long as they've made that safety determination and they're comfortable that the product is safe for its intended use, they do not have to submit any information to FDA. They don't have to give any notice to FDA that they're going to put the product on the market. And with some exceptions, dietary supplements, it's kind of a similar issue. There is a category of dietary supplement ingredients that has to go through a pre-market notification process. But it's just a notification process. It's not an approval process. So it's a pretty big range in terms of the kind of hoops you have to go through to get one category of product as opposed to another on the market. And I don't mean to oversimplify it because sometimes you'll hear, in the press, they'll say, popular press will say dietary supplements aren't regulated or cosmetics aren't regulated. And that's not entirely accurate. They are regulated in the sense that FDA has authority to take an unsafe product off the market. There are standards that apply to those products. It's just that they're not the kinds of standards that are applied to drugs and devices. And I think folks in the supplement and cosmetic industries would say, well, for good reason, we have a long track record of, by and large, all of these products being safe for their intended uses. So what's the point of expending additional resources on reviewing safety pre-market? Where there is a fairly big difference, and I already alluded to it, is in the flow of information in that pre-market versus post-market category. By the time you get that drug to market, FDA has had its hooks in just about every possible aspect. With these other products, as I mentioned, FDA might not have received any information at all. So a number of nanotechnology products are already on the market, and I went ahead and included some examples here. I think you're all probably familiar with these. Abraxane, NanoOS has been featured in some presentations at these conferences. On the cosmetic front, you might be less familiar. Hydrazen, which is billed as a nano-encapsulated triceramide, so it's a moisturizing cream, that's the function. On the dietary supplement side, nanobiosim, nano-sized diatomaceous earth for immune system support. That's the claimed function there. And then on the food packaging side, there's a lot of interest in the antimicrobial properties of silver and how you could impregnate packaging materials with nano-sized silver. But this is really just the tip of an iceberg. If you're not already familiar with it, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars has a project on emerging nanotechnologies. They have a website. They've been extremely active over the past few years in generating a wide range of papers that have looked at what FDA is doing on nano, what EPA is doing on nano, what the Consumer Product Safety Commission is doing on nano, making recommendations for the new administration. And one of the things that they have is an inventory. They routinely scour the marketplace and add products to the inventory in all the different categories: medical products, cosmetic, foods. And I think, I don't know what the latest figures are, but fairly recently, I think there were over 600 dietary supplement products on the marketplace that claimed to use nanotechnology. Now, it's not a perfect science because, who knows whether they really use nanotech ingredients or whether it's a marketing ploy. And the flip side of that coin is you could have a lot of products out there that use nanotechnology and have chosen not to market themselves that way, perhaps, for fear of liability issues. So just some examples. And I already touched on both of these points. So getting down to more specific examples, that's a pretty impressive example of a sunburn. But sunscreens are a drug product, and they fall into the category of OTC drugs, over-the-counter drugs. You might not be familiar with how those are regulated, but essentially, for the first several decades of drug regulation in the United States, FDA had authority over safety, but not over efficacy. So when FDA was finally given authority to look not just safety, but also efficacy, by that time, there were already hundreds, if not thousands, of drug products on the market, and FDA had to figure out which ones were going to stay and which ones were going to go. And the only manageable way to do that was to invent this system out of whole cloth called the OTC monograph review. So an OTC monograph is basically FDA's recipe for a type of over-the-counter drug product. It gives you the ingredients that you're allowed to use. It gives you the indications that you're allowed to claim in the labeling of the product. And I think that's probably enough background for us to be able to go forward. Essentially, as long as you have met the requirements of the monograph that applies to your product, and if it's a sunscreen, as long as I'm using the listed ingredients, as long as I'm making the claims that are allowed, I can go straight to market, and I don't have to go through FDA. There is no pre-market. Essentially, the OTC monograph, that recipe functions as the pre-market approval. So there's been some safety concerns raised with sunscreen, and to give you an idea of how long it takes to implement a monograph, the sunscreen monograph is a good example. They started rulemaking on it in 1978, and you see some of the stops along the way. In 1993, a proposed tentative final monograph. 1999, a final monograph that they said would be effective in 2 years. 2001, when it was supposed to be effective, they stayed it. 2007, they put out a proposed amendment of the final monograph. So we're looking at, going on a 20-plus year history to get this thing finalized. Now, in the meantime, what happens to all those products that are on the market? I mean, technically, you could say that they're in violation of the law. So FDA's innovation is to say enforcement discretion. We're not going to take action against an OTC product until our review is complete, unless the product poses a potential health hazard to the consumer. And in 1999, where questions were being raised about this new ingredient being used, or I'll put new in quotation marks, new ingredient being used in some of these sunscreens, FDA referred to it as micronized titanium dioxide. I think it's before the term nano came into vogue. But FDA said it's not a new ingredient. It's instead a specific grade of titanium dioxide, and we're not seeing anything to indicate that there is a particular safety concern associated with this nano-sized silver. A number of outside observers thought that the data was not quite as robust as what FDA was claiming. And an example of the kind of pressure that can be brought to bear on the agency and the kind of publicity that can be delivered on an issue like this, the International Center for Technology Assessment, one of the watchdog groups in Washington, D.C., filed a citizen petition with FDA asking them to amend the sunscreen monograph to address these engineered nanoparticles. And they asked that manufacturers of sunscreens that contain these nanoparticles be forced to file new drug approval applications and that they should recall all of the products that were currently on the market. Now, that citizen petition is still pending. I think that the more science accumulates on the issue, the more comfortable everybody, even some of the groups that were originally concerned, are with the fact that these products really don't pose a risk, that the skin does serve as a functional barrier to the kinds of nanoparticles in these products. But this, has gone so far as to be a subject of concern in Congress. The keynote speaker at a conference this past year had just finished a stint on the Hill, and as he put it, the question that was being asked up there was, ultimately, is the future of this technology going to hinge on whether nanotechnology is safe to slather on our children, which is a pretty peculiar standard to apply to a technology with as many potentially diverse applications as we've heard over the last couple of days. Shifting gears a little bit, another issue that's gained some traction, leaving aside questions of safety, is questions of labeling. The whole issue of right to know. Do consumers have a right to know that they're getting nanotechnology, whether it's in their food or on their cosmetics? The standard that FDA applies is whether there's a material fact has been omitted with respect to consequences that could result from use of the product. And so FDA's big issue really, is there a safety concern here that needs to be disclosed? And FDA has litigated on this in many contexts with many kinds of products over the course of the years. It very jealously defends its decisions about what kind of labeling should be required or should not be required. And an example from the biotech world starts with this humble creature right here, which I think you'd have to admit that is a pretty impressive source of milk. And the question is a trick question because the answer really depends on whether the cow is being given a particular drug that you might know by the trade name of Posilac. But the answer is it could be anywhere from 6 to 7 gallons per day. Pretty astonishing in my view. So the drug Posilac, recombinant bovine somatotropin, is a bioengineered animal drug that FDA approved in 1994. And it's a hormone given to cattle to increase their milk production. And FDA approved it after conducting an extensive review, not just of the safety of the drug for the animals, but the safety of any tissues or products that would be derived from the cow, including its milk. Nonetheless, FDA was sued over its approval, and FDA won. And FDA was also sued to try to compel disclosure that if milk came from a cow that had been given RBST, that should be indicated in the labeling of the milk. FDA defended its decision not to require that labeling and also prevailed on that point. And the issue really is kind of a difficult one to get a hold of because we tend to focus our discussions on safety, but a lot of the discussion here doesn't really necessarily revolves around safety. There are some issues with respect to the potential effect on small farms. Are they going to be at a disadvantage because they can't afford to administer this drug to their cattle, whereas the larger producers can? So it's a good example of how something that starts off as a safety-related issue can gain traction and acquire a whole set of other facets that really don't have much of anything to do with product safety. And I can't resist pointing out that we're holding this conference in a country that never approved RBST, even though the reviewing authorities here in Canada concluded that there really wasn't a safety issue with respect to the milk derived from the cow. There might or might not be a safety issue with respect to increase in incidence of mastitis and whatnot, but they really sort of gave a nod to the fact that there might be social dimensions to this problem that deserve further consideration. So if you drink milk derived from a cow that has been given RBST while you're in Canada, that milk was imported from the United States. It was not produced here. And this is the kind of thing that you will see today. If you surf the web, you'll see these kinds of claims. They have a symbol, RBST-free. Yogurt is made, here we are, assuring the consumer that no artificial growth hormones. The yogurt inside is RBST-free, which really sort of suggests that RBST is something that you add to yogurt as opposed to something that you give to a cow. The fact is that there really is no significant difference between milk derived from a cow given RBST and one not given RBST. But these kinds of claims start to suggest that maybe there's a health, maybe there's a safety issue. I think something that's worth pointing out in our federal system is that whatever FDA says isn't necessarily the last word, and more is not the last word because we have our 50 states. And unless state law is explicitly overridden or preempted by federal law, there's always that possibility that states are going to get in on the act. So when all this controversy was brewing over RBST, Monsanto came to FDA and said, we need you guys to do something because these claims are getting out of hand. FDA took some action, but by and large it said, look, this is not really a public health issue. We're not going to spend a lot of time and effort on this. The battle went to the states. And so now what we've seen over the course of the last 5-7 years is state by state, this battle being played out in these boards of agriculture over what should be done about RBST labeling. And it's hard not to think of this example when you start looking to see what's happening with nano, because the more people question whether the oversight is adequate, the more you have things like these local restrictions on nano that are coming into play in Berkeley. California issued a call, I believe it was toward the end of last year, for data on carbon nanotubes. And so there are jurisdictions, both cities and states, that are, where the issue is going to come up. How much of this research do we want going on in our backyard? Do we want to start compelling submission of information about where this research is being conducted? Do we want to exclude some of these products altogether? Do we want nano-free zones? And I think on the whole, probably the zeal for that kind of approach is going to be tempered by the fact that everybody wants to retain exactly the kind of industries that are invested in nanotechnology. I haven't seen something like this for nanotech. I pulled it for biotech. This is from a McKinsey press briefing that was held last year, so they're a consulting firm. But I talked a little bit about red nano versus green nano. But in industry, they also talk about white. And so here in the biotech context, they talk about red biotech and green biotech and the white biotech. And you see some of the applications for the white biotech on the right-hand side, the biofeedstock, the bioprocesses, the bioproducts. I think one thing that can give you solace when you think about these issues is that at least to date, excuse me, in the public mind, the public seems to have been able to maintain this distinction between green biotech and red nanotech. And they're willing to tolerate a certain amount of risk with red biotech, where with green biotech, the tolerance of risk remains extremely low. What'll be interesting to see is what happens as white biotech comes online and you have more and more products being sped to market in that category. Shifting over to nano, I think we're probably going to see a similar dynamic where we're going to see the green nanotech applications that we're already seeing, but a lot of questions are being raised about those. Do we really need to have that in foods? Do we really need to have that in cosmetics? Then we have the red nanotech, which I think there's a lot of enthusiasm among the public for the kinds of innovations that you all have been talking about for the last 2 days. But then I think the big question mark is with the white nanotech. And I haven't seen any good data that give us any projections for what the relative market penetration of those three sectors is going to be. There is some data that dates back to 2004 that suggests that white nanotech, the industrial applications, could exceed the medical, the red and the green applications, if you will, by several orders of magnitude, could just absolutely dwarf whatever goes on in the biomedicine sector. And so that introduces a whole other dynamic, because as I was getting ready to come here, this hit my my inbox. It's litigation news, so it's the latest issue of the American Bar Association's section of litigation. And I don't know if you can see it there, but it says the rise of nanotech litigation, and you can see the little nanobots there pictured on the front. And once you get to the article inside, this one is really primarily about EPA and whether EPA's oversight is adequate. But one of the things that they talk about is sort of consumer level of confidence in different agencies' ability to accurately or rather to do that assessment of risk benefit in a way that safeguards the public. And the level for FDA was only 60%, which is not terribly inspiring. For EPA, it was 59%, for USDA, 58%, and for businesses to make that call is 47%. So you can see that at least, according to this poll, in the public's mind, FDA is held only a slightly higher regard with respect to its ability to protect public health as would be private industry. So coming to a conclusion, I would, from my perspective, with red nanotech, I think that nobody has really serious questions about the ability of FDA to ferret out safety issues and to address those safety issues before those products come to market. It's pretty clear that if the products get to market and they get through that approval process, it's because a decision was made that the risks, the benefits outweigh the risks. So the benefits side of the equation is likely to be addressed pre-market. And then the issue of consumer choice really is off the table, because people who are going to take advantage of these therapies are going to take advantage of them because they have a need for them. So it's not the same kind of issue that you see with green nanotech products where people aren't sure what they're getting because it's not on the label. The last bullet is really the key piece. Is there going to be effective, transparent, predictable regulation of nanotechnology? And the effective part is the part that really needs some work and some boning up. The funding has increased in recent years, but it's not clear that it's enough. And just yesterday, I think, and I think FDA recognizes this, that they have some capacity building to do. NIH and FDA yesterday had a press briefing where they announced this collaboration toward further development of what they're calling regulatory science. So everything you all have been talking about is a translational science. And what FDA is concerned about is the regulatory science. And the way that the commissioner of FDA put it is, it's like you're in a rowboat and you have this arm pulling on the translational science, you have this arm pulling on the regulatory science, and her analogy was, this arm has become so atrophied, so weak, was that essentially you could end up rowing around in circles. If you want products to actually get to market, you need that regulatory science to be sufficiently robust and well-developed that it can get you there. And I'll close with what I think is just a little inside joke between us. This little publication recently, the quotation there is second bullet. Most researchers do not use suitable personal and laboratory protection equipment when handling nanomaterials that could become airborne. And then the second quote, one of the most surprising results is that nearly 3/4 of respondents reported not having internal rules to follow regarding the handling of nanomaterials. So, you all know what goes on in your research labs better than I do, but I think it would be the ultimate irony if the first documented case of a nanomaterial-induced illness were to come out of a research lab. So that's all I have for now. I'm happy to take questions. I think it would be especially interesting if for some of the questions, because I know a number of you have already had a lot of experience with FDA in the product categories that you deal with, that I'd be happy for any one of you to chip in as we talk about any questions that might come up.